What Frances Left. Part 1. The Sound Before the Silence. She had $10 and a canvas bag and a jeweler's loop on a leather cord around her neck that had belonged to her grandmother before it belonged to her, which was not much, which was, if she was being completely straight with herself, nothing at all. The $10 came from Mr. Petrakis on Elm Street in Burlington, who had a bracket clock with a cracked suspension spring and the patience of exactly no one. She had fixed it in 40 minutes on his kitchen table with the screwdrivers she kept in her jacket's inner pocket wrapped in flannel. He had given her the $10 and not made eye contact and said thank you in the voice of someone who expected to be asked for more. She hadn't asked for more. She had walked out into the cold. Vermont in early March had its own particular variety of cold that wasn't dramatic. It didn't come at you. It just arrived and stayed the way a bad memory stayed, not screaming but constant, present at the edges of every breath. She walked with her chin down and the loop pressed against her sternum under her jacket and the canvas bag on her shoulder and the $10 folded twice in her jacket pocket. She had been walking and not walking for 3 years, since Frances. The diner on State Street in Montpelier was open and warm and smelled of coffee that had been on the burner for slightly too long, which was a smell she associated with the right kind of ordinary. She sat at the counter. She ordered soup because soup was what $10 could afford and still leave something. She ate it slowly because slow was both a choice and a necessity, and because she needed to think, which was what she had been doing for 3 years. Thinking, not landing anywhere in particular, just thinking. Behind her, 2 men in a corner booth were talking. She was not trying to listen, but she was Frances Ashby's granddaughter, which meant her ears did not have an off switch. Frances had said this once when Mara was 9 years old and had corrected the sound of a wall clock from across the living room without looking at it. You are never going to be able to sit in a room and not know everything that is happening in it. That is the gift, Frances had said, and then more quietly, that is also the cost. The man with the lower voice was saying something about property and surplus lists since 2011, he said. Towns tried to give it away 3 times. Nobody bites. Which building? The old watchmaker place. Venn and Son, something like that, on Carver Street in Ridgecroft. Been locked since 1969. Something happened in Mara's chest. Not recognition exactly, not memory, something from before both of those things. The feeling of pressing your ear against wood and hearing a sound you hadn't expected. The small electric shock of a thing that was more real than you had expected it to be. She turned around on her stool. Both men looked at her with the expression of men who had not been expecting interruption. The building on Carver Street, she said. Is it still standing? The one with the lower voice was in his 60s. Flannel shirt, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Far as I know, yeah. Historical Commission's been maintaining the exterior minimally. Town can't get it off its hands. How do I find out about acquiring it? He blinked. Town clerk's office, I'd assume. Why you interested? Yes, she said. She turned back to her soup. Behind her, very quietly, one of them said something she pretended not to hear. She was good at pretending. 3 years of practice. She had grown up listening to the inside of clocks, not the outside sound, not the tick-tick-tick that anyone could hear. The inside sound, the specific small language of a mainspring unwinding through a gear train, the click and release of an escapement, the almost inaudible swing of a balance wheel calibrated to the exact frequency a clockmaker had decided it should move at, which was the frequency of keeping correct time, which was in its own way a kind of keeping faith. Frances Ashby had taught her to hear that language when she was 6 years old. Frances had been a watch and clock repair woman in a small shop on Main Street in Barre, Vermont for 31 years, not because she had planned it, because a man named Mr. Copley, who ran the shop and who had been looking for someone with a particular gift for most of his working life, had hired her at 19 to sweep floors and answer the telephone, and had discovered within her first month that the new shopgirl could hear a watch running slow from across the room. He had tested her, 3 watches on the counter, 1 running correctly, 1 running 2 seconds fast per day, 1 running 12 seconds slow. He had asked her to identify the slow one. Frances had listened for about 12 seconds. Then she had pointed. Mr. Copley had looked at her over his workbench glasses for a long moment. "You have the ear," he said. "I have been looking for someone with the ear since before you were born." He had trained her across 4 years, everything he knew, how to take apart a movement without losing any of the 243 parts that constituted a good pocket watch, how to clean each component with benzene and a horsehair brush, so fine it was barely distinguishable from air, how to hear whether an escapement was balanced by listening to the symmetry of its tick rather than by measuring it with instruments, how to know from the sound alone whether a mainspring was fatigued or merely dirty or simply tired from carrying too much weight for too long. Frances had learned quickly. She had learned because she could hear things that instruments sometimes struggled to measure. She could hear in the sound of a clock whether something was wearing wrong before the wearing became damage. She could hear a 12-second per day timing error from across a room, which was not a normal thing to be able to do, and which Mr. Copley had called a gift with the particular reverence he reserved for things he had been waiting a long time to find. He had retired in 1966. He had sold Frances the shop for $1. The price of the inventory, he said, was the 30 years she was going to spend taking care of it. He had also given her his pocket watch, a 1940s Illinois Railroad grade watch that he had carried every working day since before the war, the crystal worn and the case engraved with initials that had been his father's before they were his. He told her to keep it wound. "The day this watch stops is the day we admit something is over," he said, "and we are not admitting that." Frances had wound that watch every morning at 7:15 for 31 years. She had wound it on the last morning of her life. Frances had run the shop until her arthritis made the fine work impossible, which happened sometime in her early 70s. She had set up a bench in her kitchen and continued taking work from the circle of clients who had been bringing their clocks to her for decades and who would have kept bringing them if she had operated out of a cardboard box on the sidewalk. She had repaired by her own honest count something between 7,000 and 8,000 pieces across her career. She had also, every Saturday morning from the time Mara was 6, taught her granddaughter to listen, not to watch, not to read, not to follow instructions from a manual, to listen. The first lesson had been on a Saturday in October, 3 weeks after Mara's mother, Elaine, had moved to Portland and left Mara with Frances, in the way that some things got left without ceremony, without clear timeline, without a full explanation that covered both the reason and the return date. Frances had not discussed this directly. She had set a small mantel clock on the kitchen bench and said, "Put your ear against the case." Mara had pressed her ear to the wood. "It's ticking," she said. "That's the outside." Frances put her hand on the top of the clock, the way you put your hand on the shoulder of someone you needed to settle. "I want you to hear past the ticking. The tick is what the clock shows the world. I want you to hear what it says to itself." Mara had listened harder. She had heard beneath the tick another sound, smaller, a click and a release, a very small mechanical exhalation, perfectly regular, perfectly even. "That's the escapement," Frances said. "It's the clock's heartbeat. When it's even, the clock keeps time. When it limps, when one side of the swing is fractionally longer than the other, the clock drifts. Do you hear it limping?" Mara listened for a long time. "No, both sides sound the same." "They are the same. This clock is healthy." Frances removed the mantel clock and brought out a second one. "Now this one." Mara pressed her ear to the second case. The difference was immediate, not dramatic, a micro asymmetry in the click and release, one side fractionally softer than the other. "That one's off," Mara said. She didn't know how to say it better than that at 6. Francis looked at her with recognition, not surprise, the look of someone who had been waiting a long time and had just been confirmed in the waiting. "You have the ear," she said. It was the same sentence Mr. Copley had said to her over 40 years before. They had worked together every Saturday after that for 11 years. By 10, Mara could diagnose most movement problems by sound before opening the case. By 12, she had done her first full mainspring replacement. By 15, she was doing most of the repairs herself, while Francis sat beside her and watched with the careful attention of someone who understood that watching was its own form of teaching. By 17, Francis's arthritis had progressed far enough that she mostly described what to do rather than showing it, and Mara's hands had learned enough to translate the description without losing anything in the process. The work had given Mara something that nothing else had. It had given her the experience of being necessary to a task that did not have opinions about who she was or where she had come from or what her mother was doing in Portland. A clock that needed a new escapement wheel needed Mara specifically. It didn't care that she had been left. It didn't organize its requirements around anyone's convenience but its own, which was, she had understood later, a form of mercy. Francis had died on a Saturday morning when Mara was 17, a cardiac event at the kitchen bench. She had been holding a client's pocket watch, a 1940s Waltham that a woman in Montpellier had brought in because it was her father's and it hadn't run in 20 years. Francis had set it carefully on the bench mat before she died, which was exactly what Francis would do, because a watch set down carelessly could be damaged, and Francis did not damage watches. Mara had taken the loop, the set of screwdrivers, the wooden stool, the photograph of Francis at the shop bench in 1979, loop in her eye, a clock movement open in front of her, a small tin of clock oil that had lived on the kitchen shelf for 30 years and was still viscous and effective, and Mr. Copley's pocket watch, the Illinois Railroad piece, with the worn crystal and the engraved initials which Francis had wound every morning at 7:15 for 31 years. The Ashby house and everything else in it had been handled by people Mara had no claim on. The 3 years after that had been what they had been, which was not worth describing in detail, which was the kind of hard that didn't advertise itself. She had found work where she could find it. She had fixed clocks wherever she was. She had kept the loop around her neck and the screwdrivers wrapped in their flannel, and she had not once set either of them down for good, because setting them down for good would have been saying something she was not willing to say about herself or about Francis or about what the work meant. She walked to the Ridgecroft town clerk's office the morning after the diner, an hour and 40 minutes on a bus, and then 12 minutes on foot in the cold. The office was in a white clapboard municipal building on the town green next to a post office and a small library with a sign in the window about overdue fines. She pushed open the door. The woman behind the counter was 65 years old and had the organized stillness of someone who had spent decades processing other people's paperwork with complete accuracy and no drama. Silver hair, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a desk so clean it looked like a statement of intent rather than a working surface. She looked at Mara for a moment. "You're here about the Venn building," she said, not a question. Mara stopped. "How did you—" The surplus listing was updated yesterday with a note about a prospective buyer inquiry. Mrs. Braun looked at her over her glasses. "Small town. The clerk handles the listing updates." She reached for a file that appeared to have been maintained for exactly this contingency. Venn and Son timepieces, Carver Street, closed 1969. The building has been on our surplus list since 2011. Before that, it was under Historic Preservation Review, which ran out of funding. How much? Mrs. Braun looked at her. The town, she said, would accept $10 and a written commitment to maintain the structure. Mara put the $10 on the counter. Mrs. Braun looked at the bills, then at Mara. Then she stamped the deed with the specific finality of someone who had been doing this for 35 years and understood that paperwork done correctly was itself a form of permanence. She set the deed on the counter. Then she opened the top drawer of her desk and produced a key on a leather fob, brass, heavy, worn smooth in the way of keys that had been held and turned and held again across a very long time. Silas Venn locked that door on November 15th, 1969, Mrs. Braun said. He walked this key to this office and he said, "Hold this for whoever comes. We have been holding it for 55 years. She set the key in front of Mara. Mara reached for it. "One more thing," Mrs. Braun said. She said it carefully. "The way you said something you had been deciding whether to say for a while." Mara waited. "Your grandmother, Frances Ashby." She looked at Mara directly. "She came here asking about this building 7 times over the course of 7 years, starting in 2014. The air in the clerk's office changed, not dramatically, the way air changed when a temperature shifted and your body registered it before your mind did. 7 times, Mara said. 7 visits, spaced irregularly. Always the same question was, the building still available? Was anyone else interested? I asked her once why she kept coming back." Mrs. Braun paused. "She said she was making sure it would be there when it was needed." Mara looked at the key in her hand. The leather fob was warm from the drawer. "She never told me," Mara said. Mrs. Braun said nothing. She just held the door open. Carver Street was 4 blocks from the clerk's office. The building appeared as soon as she turned the corner. Narrow, clapboard, a boarded-over display window with plywood so weathered it had gone silver, a sign above the door in faded paint, the lettering almost gone, Van and Son timepieces. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The cold pressed in from all directions. The maple tree at the edge of the lot had buds on it that hadn't opened yet. A truck went past on Carver Street. Someone's dog barked once from across the green and then stopped. 7 visits. 7 times Frances had come to this clerk's office and asked if the building was still there, and had never mentioned it, had never said there was a clockmaker's shop in Ridgecroft that you should know about, making sure it would be there when it was needed. When it was needed. For whom? She already knew the answer. She put the key in the lock. It turned smoothly, no resistance at all, as if it had been doing this every day. The door swung open. One long room, plank floors very old, the grain raised by decades of temperature change, plaster walls with cracks she could already see would need work, a pressed tin ceiling with a stamped geometric pattern dimly visible beneath decades of fine dust. The room smelled of old wood and something metallic underneath it that she recognized immediately and completely, the residue of benzene from clockwork absorbed into the walls and the floor and the ceiling across 50 years and still present the way certain kinds of clean had a permanence to them. That mess never achieved. A workbench along the left wall with small drawers below it, each labeled in faded ink. Empty shelves along the right wall brackets still in place. Tools on the workbench surface arranged in a row with the care of someone who had put them down, knowing they would need to be picked up in a specific order. And, against the back wall, floor to ceiling, a master regulator clock. Tall mahogany case, glass-fronted door showing the movement, white enamel dial with Roman numerals, brass pendulum absolutely still, the hands at 3:22, not moving, not ticking, silent for 55 years in a room that smelled of work that had been done by someone who knew what they were doing. She crossed the floor. She opened the glass door. The movement was exposed. Brass plates, the gear train, the escapement, the mainspring barrel, empty. Someone had removed the mainspring from this clock, had taken the heart of it out before closing the door. She ran her hand along the case and then moved around to the back. The mahogany back panel was held by screws. She leaned in. 6 screws, new screws, but not all the same age. She looked more carefully, the way she looked at everything in a clock, not with the general sweep of attention most people use, but with the specific focus of someone who had been trained to see the thing inside the thing. The outer 4 screws were very new, barely oxidized, 2 weeks old at most. But the inner 2 screws, the ones closer to the center of the panel, were slightly older, not years older, months. The oxidation pattern was different. The compression marks around the holes were from a different bit. 2 sets of screws, 2 different hands, 2 different visits. Someone had removed this panel twice. Okay, stop. Think. 2 people came here before you, 2 different times. Neither of them found what they were looking for, or the panel would still be open. Both of them were careful enough to put the screws back. Neither of them was careful enough to use the right screws. She went back to the clerk's office. Mrs. Braun looked up when Mara came back through the door. She didn't look surprised. "Someone came here before me," Mara said. "More than once." A pause. "Yes," Mrs. Braun said. "You knew?" "I had a responsibility to report it. I did report it." Mrs. Braun set down her pen. 3 years ago, approximately a week after your grandmother passed, someone accessed the building using a duplicate key. We believe they had a key made from a wax impression at some earlier point. When I noticed signs of entry, I had the locks changed and requested the original key be kept here rather than in the usual lockbox. She paused. "We didn't know who they were. There was no evidence left behind, and the deed was in the town's name, so there was limited legal recourse without identifying the party. And more recently," Mrs. Braun looked at her carefully, "the lock was not compromised this time. We believe someone accessed through the rear window, which the Historical Commission replaced 2 years ago. We found evidence of the visit when we did our quarterly inspection 6 weeks ago. 3 years ago, right after Frances died, someone who knew Frances, someone who knew about this building, someone who had been waiting just as Frances had been waiting for a specific moment to come here." "The week Frances died," Mara said. "Yes. They knew about the shop." "It would seem so." Mara looked at the key in her hand. "Is there anyone who has been asking about this building other than my grandmother?" Mrs. Braun held her gaze for a moment. "There have been other inquiries," she said. "I would need to check the records." "Please," Mara said, "check." She went back to the shop. She found a flathead screwdriver in the workbench drawer, labeled in Silas Venn's handwriting, flathead 3 millimeters. She backed out the 6 screws, set them in 2 groups on the bench sorted by age. She photographed them with her phone. Then she removed the panel. Behind it, in a cavity approximately 14 inches deep between the clock case and the wall, a space she hadn't expected to be there built into the original construction, invisible from the outside. A brass barrel, heavy, a mainspring inside, a canvas pouch tied with a cord, and a folded letter in an envelope cream paper, slightly brittle at the edges, dated in the upper left corner, November 15th, 1969. She set the barrel and pouch on the workbench. She opened the envelope. The handwriting inside was small and precise and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had spent a life working at close scale and had let that precision colonize everything they did. "To whoever finds the spring, my name is Silas Venn. I have maintained and repaired the clocks of this valley from my father's bench since 1947 and from my own since 1959. Today is November 15th, 1969. I am closing this shop because the battery clock has made my work commercially impossible, and I am old enough to be honest about what that means. I am removing the mainspring from the regulator because the spring is the clock. A clock without its spring is a cabinet. With the spring, it has a purpose. I am leaving the spring for the person who knows the difference, which is not the same as leaving it for the first person who removes the panel. It is leaving it for the right person. I must tell you something about how this compartment was built. My colleague and friend Mr. Copley of Bahrain has corresponded with me since 1952. Across the years of our correspondence, he told me many times of a woman he found and trained, a woman named Frances, who had what he called the ear. He said she was the finest natural listener he had encountered in 50 years of this trade. He said the quality was not learned but inherited, that it ran in bloodlines the way certain abilities ran quietly, not showing itself until the right work called it out. I believed Copley. He was not a man who exaggerated. So I built this compartment to be found by someone who had learned from Frances, or by Frances herself, or by whoever she passed the work to. The hidden panel does not have a mechanical release. It has no latch and nothing that operates by force. It opens when you find the seam. The seam runs along the lower left edge of the compartment wall. The wood at the seam is 1/4 inch thinner than the surrounding panel. A person with hands trained to feel the difference between sound wood and hollow wood will find it. A clockmaker's hands, hands that have learned over years of work what wood feels like when it is bearing weight and what it feels like when it is not. Press both palms flat. Move slowly. Let your hands tell you what your eyes cannot. The gold in the canvas pouch is yours to steward as you see fit. The tools are yours. The spring is yours. A clockmaker's shop without a clockmaker is a room waiting to be wrong about itself. Start the clock. Silas Venn, Ridgecroft, Vermont. November 15th, 1969. She read it twice. She set it down on the bench. Frances' name was in this letter, written by a man who had died before Mara was born, written from a correspondence with Mr. Copley, who had trained Frances, who had trained Mara. 3 people, 1 line, each person teaching the next one how to hear things that couldn't be measured. She pressed both palms flat against the interior wall of the compartment. She moved slowly. Her hands had cleaned mainsprings and balanced wheels and adjusted escapements for 11 years. They knew the difference. She moved them across the plaster surface, and then at the lower left corner, something changed. The resistance under her palms shifted, not dramatically, just the difference between solid and not solid that she had been taught palm by palm, Saturday by Saturday to feel. She pressed gently. The panel shifted inward. Behind it, nothing additional. What she had already found on the bench had come from the primary compartment. This inner space was smaller. She reached in. Her fingers touched something flat. She pulled it out. A photograph, black and white, printed on heavier paper than modern photographs, used the edges slightly curled from years in the dark. A woman sitting at a workbench. This workbench, in this room. She was approximately 40 years old in the photograph. Dark hair, a loop pressed to one eye, her hands positioned over a clock movement that was open on the mat in front of her. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at the work. Mara knew that posture. She had grown up watching that posture. She had inherited that posture. The woman in the photograph was Frances Ashby, not at her own bench in Bahrain, not in her kitchen, here in Silas Venn's shop, at Silas Venn's workbench, with a loop in her eye and her hands doing the work and the master regulator visible in the background through the glass door, the pendulum in the photograph hanging still. She was sitting in the second chair, the chair beside the bench, not the master's chair, the chair where the person learning sat, the chair where every student had sat across every tradition of craft, the chair that said, "I am here to receive what you are willing to give." Frances had been in this room, had sat at this bench, had sat in the chair of a student, and had never said a word. Mara set the photograph on the bench beside the letter. She stood very still for a moment. The canvas pouch held coins, 41 of them, gold. She could tell by the density before she opened the pouch fully. She set the pouch beside the photograph. She picked up the mainspring barrel. A mainspring makes no sound in isolation. It is a coiled strip of hardened steel compressed into a brass cylinder, storing energy in the tension of its own wound metal. It has no voice except in context, except installed in a clock that allows it to unwind through a gear train and release that stored energy tick by tick, tooth by tooth through the escapement. She set the barrel on the bench. She found a mainspring winder in the third drawer, found clock oil in the fourth drawer, stoppered in small glass bottles, still viscous, found a horsehair brush and a cotton cloth and a set of clock screwdrivers in a wooden rack sorted by blade width. Everything in its place, everything where it had waited for 55 years for the right pair of hands. She cleaned the gear train pivot by pivot. She checked the escapement, the pallet faces, the banking pins, the lock and draw. She oiled the pivots, 2 drops each, not more. Frances had said this hundreds of times. 2 drops, more than 2 drops, and you're cleaning the movement again in a year. She seated the mainspring barrel in the arbor, hooked the inner coil to the winding post, engaged the click spring. She reached up and set the brass pendulum swinging. A single push, gentle. The pendulum swung left. The gear train engaged. The escapement ticked, then ticked again, then again. The sound moved through the mahogany case and into the room, not filling it immediately, but finding it gradually, the way heat found a cold room, spreading from the source outward until the whole space, all space was carrying it. A steady, even unhurried tick. This was a movement built in a specific decade by a specific craftsman who understood what permanence sounded like and had built it in. She stepped back to the center of the room. The tick was even. Both sides of the swing were equal. No limp, no asymmetry. After 55 years of standing in the dark with its heart removed, the master regulator in the Venn and Son shop on Carver Street in Ridgecroft, Vermont, was keeping time. She looked at the photograph of Frances, sitting in the second chair, not the clockmaker's chair, the student's chair. Frances had come here and learned something, had spent time in this room at this bench, had sat in the place where you sat when someone was teaching you, and had then gone home to Barre and had spent years and years transmitting what she had received to a girl on a wooden stool in a kitchen on a Saturday morning. Every Saturday, for 11 years, the clock ticked behind her. She looked at the letter, at the photograph, at the canvas pouch, and the brass barrel now seated in the movement turning behind the glass door. Silas Venn had written, "I am leaving the spring for the right person." Frances had come here, had learned here, had sat in the second chair, had then spent 11 years of Saturday mornings teaching Mara everything she learned, making sure it would be there when it was needed. The right person. Mara Ashby was 20 years old. She had $10 in her pocket, or had had $10 before she gave them to Mrs. Braun. She had a canvas bag and a loop and a set of screwdrivers wrapped in flannel and a photograph of a woman she had loved more than she had understood. She loved her sitting in a room she had never known existed, learning something she had then spent years passing on. She pressed her palm flat against the glass door of the master regulator, the way she pressed her palm against wood to feel what it was holding. The glass was cold. The tick moved through it. Real. She said very quietly to the room, to the clock, to the photograph of Frances in the second chair, "I'll start the clock. It's already started." The tick moved through the plank floor and the plaster walls and the pressed tin ceiling, and the shop, which had been silent since 1969, was no longer silent. Part 2. What the Hands Know. The coin dealer in Montpellier was a woman named Dr. Ashford, which was not a name Mara had expected, though she wasn't sure what name she had expected. 70s, reading glasses on a chain, the hands of someone who had spent a career handling things that were small and valuable and required very careful touching. She examined each of the 41 coins in silence. Loop first, then scale, Then a reference book she opened to 3 different pages. She did not rush. She did not perform certainty. She looked at what was there and arrived at a number based on what was actually there, which was the kind of professional discipline Mara recognized and respected. Gold pieces, she said, various denominations, various dates, pre-1933, which matters for valuation, some numismatic premium on the earlier issues. She set the last coin down with the care of someone who understood that objects that had lasted a century deserved to continue lasting. I can offer $22,000. Mara did the math. $22,000. She had $10 3 days ago. She had $10 3 days ago, and a canvas bag, and a loop, and 3 years of proving you could survive things that looked unsurvivable. And now she was sitting across from a woman with reading glasses who was offering to write her a check for $22,000. That's fine, she said. Her voice was level because Frances had taught her that the price you said out loud sounded different depending on whether you believed it. She believed it. Dr. Ashford wrote the check. Mara walked to the bank in Ridgecroft, opened an account, deposited the check, walked back out into the March air. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, pressed her palm flat against the brick face of the bank the way she pressed her palm against clock cases, just to feel what was real. The brick was cold, solid, real. She had work to do. The first week was the floor. The plank floor in the shop had 2 sections where the wood had warped and cupped from decades of temperature cycling without proper climate control. She found a local hardware supplier on Route 2 who had reclaimed Vermont pine that matched the original grain. She pulled the damaged boards herself, reset the joists, fitted the new boards, and sanded them by hand to match the surrounding surface. She had never done finished carpentry before. She learned it the way she learned everything, by doing it wrong, once identifying what was wrong and doing it correctly the second time. The second week was the plaster. She checked out 3 books from the Ridgecroft Public Library on historic plaster repair. She mixed compound and applied and waited and sanded and applied again. The first section she did cracked along the edge where she had troweled too thick. She scraped it off, mixed thinner. The second attempt held. She was sleeping on a folding cot in the back of the shop. She had bought the cot from a surplus store for $18, a wool blanket for $12, and a small electric kettle for $7. She had no particular desire to sleep anywhere else. The master regulator ticked through the night with the even patience of something that had been doing this for 55 years, had recently been allowed to start again, and had no intention of stopping. She wound the spring each morning before doing anything else. 3 measured turns of the key, never more, the way the movement required. Mrs. Braun came on the second Saturday. She knocked once and came in without being invited, which Mara would come to understand was simply Mrs. Braun's relationship to buildings she had been responsible for. She carried a cardboard box, inside a coffee maker, a cast iron skillet, a bag of groceries, 2 mugs. I am not, Mrs. Braun said, setting the box on the workbench, going to have Silas Venn's replacement going without a proper coffee pot. He would haunt me. She looked at the patched plaster, at the repaired floor sections, at the master regulator ticking behind Mara with the pendulum swinging in the glass case. Good, she said, as if confirming something she had been waiting to confirm. She came back the following Saturday with a small bookshelf, the Saturday after that with bench lights that gave better illumination than the original overhead fixture. She always brought something, a bag of apples, work gloves, a box of tea. She never stayed long. She drank 1 cup of coffee and listened to the regulator tick and said before she left, "It sounds right." It always sounded right, because it was. Word spread the way word spread in small Vermont towns, by name, by trust, by the slow economy of reputation that operated in places where everyone knew everyone's everything, and a newcomer either earned a place in that system or didn't. A retired school teacher from the west end of town brought in a bracket clock that had belonged to her parents. She set it on the counter and said, "My father said only one person in this valley could fix these properly. I assumed he meant Silas Venn. I assume you're what he would have said if he'd had more time." Mara repaired it in an afternoon. He told his colleagues. She told her friends. The bracket clock came back correctly regulated, sounding the way it was supposed to sound, and that was the beginning of the word spreading. A man from the farm on Route 9 brought a pocket watch in a canvas pouch that smelled of machine oil. He said it had been in a drawer for 15 years. She opened the case and listened before she touched the movement the way Frances had taught her, and told him what was wrong before she had removed a single plate. He looked at her and said nothing, which was, she had learned a Vermont form of deep respect. A woman drove up from Barre with a wall clock she said had not kept correct time since her husband died, which had been 4 years ago. Mara adjusted the escapement and regulated the movement until the tick was even on both sides, and when the woman listened to it running again, she put one hand on the counter to steady herself. "That's the sound," she said. Mara didn't ask which sound. She knew which sound. The sound of something that had stopped and started again. The sound of time resuming where it had paused. An older man from the valley's east side came in one morning with a mantel clock wrapped in a dish towel that had belonged to his grandmother, who had brought it from somewhere in Europe in 1923. He didn't ask for it to be made new. He asked for it to be made honest again. Mara replaced the worn pivot in the center wheel and adjusted the strike mechanism and handed it back to him, and he held it to his ear for a long time before he said anything. "Same sound," he said. "Exactly the same sound as when I was a boy." Each clock that came through the shop was an act of trust, a family handing Mara a piece of their history and choosing to believe she understood what irreplaceable meant. She made that promise without words each time and kept it. Marcus Holt arrived on a Thursday in April. She heard his car before she heard him. Large, driven with the deliberate care of someone who understood vehicles required thoughtful handling. The door closed carefully. He was 55 years old, not a large man, solid in the way of someone who had spent a working life in physical occupations. Good coat, good boots for Vermont roads in April. A face that had been carrying something for a long time and had stopped advertising the fact. He looked at the shop exterior first, then at the sign, then at the display window which Mara had unboarded and cleaned, and in which the master regulator was now visible from the street pendulum swinging. He came in. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," she said. She didn't put down the movement she was working on. "Marcus Holt." He looked around the room slowly, at the repaired walls, at the clean workbench, at the row of movements waiting in order of priority. "You've done considerable work." She set down the movement, turned around, looked at him the way she looked at a clock when she was trying to understand what was wrong before she opened the case. "I know who you are," she said. He looked at her. "Or I will shortly," she said. "What do you want?" He paused, the pause of someone who had rehearsed this and was deciding whether to use the rehearsed version or the honest one. He chose honest. "My grandfather was Thomas Holt," he said. "He was a watchmaker in Randolph, Vermont, from 1922 until 1944, when his workshop closed." He said it with the care of someone who had said this many times privately and was saying it out loud for the first time. He was one of 11 craftsmen in this region who were defrauded by a materials broker between 1934 and 1941. He lost approximately $4,000 in advance payments for parts and materials that were never delivered, which in 1938 was enough to nearly collapse his business. Mara waited. "He survived it," Marcus continued. "He kept working for another 6 years before his hands gave out. He died in 1967. He never recovered the money. He never talked about it much. He looked at the master regulator, but he kept records. and the records mentioned Silas Venn, and Silas Venn's name was in a letter I found in my grandfather's papers after my father died, a letter from Venn that mentioned the debt, that mentioned Thomas Holt by name. A letter, Mara said. Yes. You're saying there's a letter from Silas Venn in your grandfather's papers that mentions Thomas Holt. Yes. Dated 1968. Venn wrote to my grandfather saying he had been attempting to recover what the broker had taken, that he had not yet succeeded, but intended to continue. He met her eyes. And then Venn closed his shop in 1969, and there was no further contact. Mara looked at him. He looked back. You didn't come about the building, she said. No, you came about the letter. I came about what the letter may say, he said. Specifically, whether there is documentation of the recovery effort, whether my grandfather is mentioned in that documentation, whether his name is recorded anywhere as someone Venn was trying to repay. He paused. My grandfather went to his grave having lost that money. My father went to his grave not knowing whether anyone ever tried to make it right. I would like to know. The room was very quiet except for the clock. Mara looked at him. He was not lying. She was good at hearing the difference between what was said and what was true, and Marcus Holt was telling the truth as he understood it. But then he did something. He looked at the master regulator, specifically at the back of the case, visible through the gap between the clock and the wall, and he said, the panel access behind the main case, it's been re-secured recently, and he said it the way someone said something they already knew, not observed, already known. Mara went very still. The panel access behind the main case, that was not a generic description. That was the specific location, the description of someone who had stood in this room and looked at that panel and touched those screws. You were here, she said. He held her gaze. 3 years ago, she said, right after Francis died, you had a key made. A pause. Yes, he said. You took the panel off. I didn't find anything. I replaced it. With new screws. Yes. The clock ticked. Okay. So, the man standing in front of her had been in this room before her, had removed the panel she removed, had looked at the interior of the compartment and found nothing. The mainspring and the gold had been in the secondary compartment, the one behind the one he'd opened. He had found the outer cavity and seen nothing and concluded there was nothing, because he had been looking, not listening, not feeling for wood that was different from the wood around it. You were also here 2 weeks ago, she said. He looked at her. There are 2 sets of screws, she said. The first set you put in 3 years ago, the second set 2 weeks ago, before I came. His jaw set slightly. I thought maybe I'd missed something the first time. You had. She looked at him evenly. You missed it again. The silence that followed was several seconds long. I'm not asking for money, he said. I want you to understand that clearly. I am not making any legal claim on this property or its contents. What I'm asking for is documentation. If there is any record that Silas Venn attempted to repay my grandfather's loss, even a notation, even an indirect mention, I would like to know it exists. For my family. He paused. That's the whole of it. Mara looked at him. She looked at the letter on the shelf above the workbench. The letter from Silas Venn that mentioned Francis's name and contained, she hadn't yet fully explored whatever records or notations Venn had made before closing the shop. She could hand him the letter right now. She could let him read it, let him find whatever was there, let whatever this was become whatever it needed to become, and everything would stop. The uncertainty would stop. The sense of standing on ground she didn't fully understand yet would stop. She could hand one man one document and step back and let it be simple. She thought about Francis coming to Mrs. Braun 7 times over 7 years to make sure this building was still available. Francis hadn't said, make sure it's available if someone needs it. She had said, make sure it's there when it's needed. Not for Marcus Holt, for something else, for something Mara didn't fully understand yet. I need more time, Mara said. He looked at her. I have been in this building for 5 weeks. I haven't fully understood what's here yet. I am not going to make decisions about documents I haven't fully read. That's fair, he said. I'm not saying no, I'm saying not yet. That's fair, he said again. He left. She stood in the center of the room after the door closed and listened to her breathing until it evened. That evening, she sat on the floor with her back against the master regulator case and held the letter from Silas Venn and read it again and then a third time. She looked for Thomas Holt's name. She didn't find it, which didn't mean it wasn't there. The letter was an introduction, not an accounting. The full record, if there was one, might be in the journals, in the workbench drawers, in whatever Silas Venn had left that she hadn't yet found. She thought about Marcus Holt's face when he talked about his grandfather, the combination of grief and need that appeared when someone was trying to recover something for a person they could no longer give it to directly. She understood that combination. She had been living inside it for 3 years. She did not sleep well, but she got up in the morning and wound the spring and made coffee and went back to work, which was what you did. Clara Venn arrived on a Tuesday in May. She drove a practical car from Burlington. She was 40 years old, with the focused, undemonstrative energy of someone who spent their working life in proximity to important objects and had learned that the objects required the attention, not the person providing it. Brown hair going slightly silver at the temples, a canvas tote bag that was considerably heavier than it looked. She stood in the shop doorway for a moment. She looked at the master regulator. She looked at it for about 30 seconds without speaking, not the way someone looked at an object they recognize, the way someone looked at an object that was important to them in a way they hadn't fully expected to feel. It's running, she said. Since March, Mara said. He always said it would run again. When the right person came, she crossed the room and stood close to the glass door, close enough to see the escapement wheel turning. He said it in his journal, in November 1969, the day he closed the shop. You're Clara Venn, Mara said. Yes. She looked at Mara. And I was here 2 weeks ago, before you came. She said it cleanly. No hedging, no preamble. I want you to know that. I came through the back window. I came because I've been reading his journals for 6 months and I needed to see the shop. I couldn't find what he described finding. I replaced the window and left. You put in the second set of screws, Mara said. Yes, I know I was trespassing. I accept whatever follows from that. She looked at the master regulator. I just needed to see if it was real. It's real, Mara said. I know that now. She set the canvas tote on the bench. I brought you something. She opened the tote. 15 cloth-covered journals, each labeled on the spine in small handwritten numbers, 1 through 15, the earliest dated 1952, the latest dated 1969. My grandfather's work journals, Clara said. I've been cataloging his papers since my mother died last year and left me the estate contents. She touched the spine of the 8th journal. Your grandmother's name appears in these journals multiple times, beginning in 1962. Mara went very still. Mr. Copley and my grandfather corresponded for almost 30 years, Clara said. I found years of letters in the estate papers. They discussed the craft, the trade, their clients, the state of clockmaking. She opened the 8th journal to a marked page. This entry is from March 1963. He writes, Copley writes again about the woman he found. Frances, her name is. He has been training her for almost 2 years. He says she has the ear in a way he has not encountered in 40 years of practice. He tested her. He put 5 watches in a row running and had her stand with her back to them at a distance of 12 feet. He asked her to identify the 2 that were losing time. Mara leaned in. Clara continued reading. She identified both in under 20 seconds, without instruments, without looking at a single face. He says one of the 2 watches was losing only 2 seconds per day. She found it. 2 seconds. From 12 feet away with her back turned, the clock ticked. 2 seconds per day. Frances could hear a 2-second per day timing error from 12 feet away without looking. Mara had known Frances could hear errors, had grown up watching her hear them, had thought she understood the range of what Frances could do, had spent 11 years beside her, and had built a mental picture of her grandmother's ability. She had not understood the range, not even close. A 2-second per day timing error was the threshold of detection for professional timing instruments. The difference between a watch that kept perfect time and one that lost 2 seconds per day was a difference of barely 1 part in 43,000. 2 seconds in an entire day, a fraction of a fraction. Frances had heard that. From across a room, without looking, Mara pressed her palms flat on the bench. He writes about her again in 1966, Clara continued turning pages, and in 1968 she turned carefully. And then in November 1969, on the day he closed the shop, he writes this. She found the page. I have left everything as it should be. Copley's Frances will come, or her student will come, or someone she made will come. They will know how to find the compartment. They will know what to do with what is inside. I have written this in the letter I am leaving with the spring, so they will understand the chain. The chain does not break. It has never broken yet. Mara looked at the clock, at the pendulum swinging behind the glass. The chain does not break. She thought about Frances on the bench in the photograph, the second chair, the student's chair, Frances sitting in the student's chair in this room, learning something that she then carried back to Bari and spent 11 years of Saturday mornings transmitting. She came here, Mara said. Yes, Clara said. He writes about her visit in the supplemental notebook, the one that wasn't part of the 15. She reached into the tote and brought out a smaller journal, its cover more worn. 1984, summer. He writes, Frances Ashby came, Copley student now 30 years in the trade herself. She wrote to me through Copley's old address. She came from Bari. She stayed 3 days. I taught her everything I still had left to teach. Her hands know more than she gives herself credit for. I showed her where the secondary compartment was. I showed her how to feel the seam. She found it in 11 minutes. I told her, go home and teach someone. On board. 3 days. Frances had come here and spent 3 days learning from the last true clockmaker of the valley, and then had gone back to Bari, and had spent the next 11 years of Saturday mornings teaching Mara every single thing she had received. She never told me, Mara said. No, Clara said. Why? Clara looked at her for a moment. I've been trying to answer that. My grandfather didn't record her answer if she gave one, but in 1984, you weren't born yet. Frances knew the gift, but not the recipient. And later, when you were there, maybe she thought it was better if you found it yourself, if you came to it the way she came to it, without being told, without being given a destination, just being given the tools and Saturday morning and 11 years, and then your hands will know what to do when you need them to. I'm not here about the gold coins, Clara said. I want to say that clearly. I don't have any claim to the estate contents. My grandfather left what he left for exactly who he left it for. I came because I wanted to understand why he spent the last year of his life writing about a chain of people he had never fully met. She looked at Mara. I understand it now. She stayed for 4 hours. She was not a clockmaker. She was a museum curator with a historian's understanding of how objects accumulated meaning across time. She talked about the other craftsmen of the valley, what she had found in her grandfather's papers about them, their shops, their families. She talked about the specific culture of watch and clock repair in mid-century Vermont, which had been more than a trade, had been a form of relationship between people and their own histories. She talked about Thomas Holt. My grandfather mentions him multiple times, she said. Thomas Holt of Randolph. He was on the list of 11. My grandfather kept records of what each man was owed by the broker, what was taken, what Silas later tried to recover and restore. Someone came here about Thomas Holt, Mara said. Clara looked at her. His grandson, Marcus Holt. He came here in April. Mara paused. He wants documentation that your grandfather was trying to repay the debt. Clara was quiet for a moment. That documentation exists, she said. It's in the journals, entries from the late 1950s through 1969. My grandfather tracked every recovery attempt, every estate sale, every settlement, every partial return. She touched the stack of journals. Thomas Holt's loss is documented. The partial recovery against it is documented. And the reason none of it was directly returned is documented too. Most of the men had died by the time Silas began recovering anything. So Marcus's grandfather died not knowing. Yes, the clock ticked. Would you be willing to speak with Marcus Holt, Mara said, to share what the journals say? Clara looked at her. Yes, she said. Of course, that's exactly what I do with this information. That's why he kept records, so that eventually someone could know. She left the 15 journals on the bench. She left the supplemental notebook on top of the stack. She said she would come back Thursday. She said she would contact Marcus Holt if Mara was willing to provide his information. After she left, Mara sat on the stool at the workbench for a long time. She thought about Francis sitting in the second chair. She thought about Silas writing "The chain does not break." She thought about 11 years of Saturday mornings and the specific quality of Francis's attention when she was watching Mara work, not impatient, not hovering, just present in the careful way of someone who was watching something take shape and understood that the shaping required time. She had thought Francis was teaching her a trade. She had not understood that Francis was completing a transmission that had begun before either of them existed in the same room. Elaine came on a Friday evening. Mara heard a car she didn't recognize park on Carver Street. She was at the bench with a bracket clock open in front of her. The movement exposed the mainspring, replaced and the gear train cleaned and the escapement balanced, and the only remaining work the fine regulation that required listening and patience and small adjustments. The door opened. The woman who came through it was 42 years old and looked like what Mara might look like in 20 years. Dark hair with silver beginning at the temples, the same narrow set of the jaw, the same stillness that Mara had always thought came from Francis, but apparently came from further back than that from whatever in the bloodline both of them had received. Elaine, her mother, who had moved to Portland when Mara was 6 years old, who had not come back. Mara set down the regulator she was holding, carefully, because it was a client's piece, and clients' pieces did not get set down carelessly, regardless of what was happening in the air of the room around them. She turned around. They looked at each other across the workroom. Mara, Elaine said, she said the name the way you said something you had practiced saying and were now actually saying for the first time. You read about the shop, Mara said. Yes. The piece in the Burlington paper. Yes. Elaine came a step further into the room and then stopped. She was not approaching. She was making sure she was within speaking distance and no further. I'm not. She stopped. I didn't come to ask you for anything. I came to give you something. She reached into her coat and produced an envelope. Not new. The envelope had been handled before, held multiple times, set down, picked up again. The handwriting on the outside was Francis's handwriting. She wrote it the week before she died, Elaine said. She sent it to me at the Portland address. I don't know how she had it. I hadn't given it to her. But she had it. She held the envelope out. Mara looked at the envelope. She wrote to you, Mara said. Yes. About what? About this. Elaine's hand holding the envelope was very still. About you, about the gift you have, about a clockmaker's shop in Ridgecroft that you were going to find when you were ready to find it. A pause. She asked me to make sure you found it, to make sure you were pointed toward Ridgecroft when the time was right. to make sure nothing was in your way. Her voice, which had been steady, became something more fragile. She told me what to do, and she trusted me to do it. Mara looked at her. You didn't, Mara said. No. You didn't come. You didn't send word. You didn't. No. Flat. Honest. Not an excuse. I got the letter. I read it, and She stopped. I didn't know how to come. I didn't know how to show up after everything. I thought. She stopped again. I convinced myself you would find it anyway, that you didn't need me to be the one to point the way, that I would just stay out of it and let it happen. And then Frances died. Yes. And I didn't find it right away. I spent 3 years not finding it. Elaine closed her eyes for a moment, opened them. Yes. The clock ticked. Mara took the envelope. She did not open it. Not yet. She held it in both hands the way she held clock movements she was assessing before she opened the case, just holding it, letting her hands tell her the weight of it. Why now? Mara said. Because you found it anyway, Elaine said. Without me, you did what Frances said you would do, and I had nothing to do with it. And she paused. I owed you the letter, whether or not anything follows from it. You were supposed to have it. She meant for you to have it. Mara looked at this woman, who was 42 years old, who had left when Mara was 6, who had been a shape in the abstract for 16 years, not quite a person, just the outline of an absence, and who was now standing in the shop that Frances had spent 7 years making sure would be waiting. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, Mara said. I know. It's not all right. I know. But, she looked at the envelope in her hands, then at Elaine. You came, you're here now, and you brought this. She paused. I'm going to read the letter, and then I'm going to need some time to think about what happens after that. Elaine looked at her. She looked like someone who had expected less composure. Okay, Elaine said. Okay, Mara said. Elaine left. The door closed. Mara stood in the center of the room with the envelope in both hands and the clock ticking behind her, and the 15 journals stacked on the corner of the bench, and the photograph of Frances in the second chair on the shelf above everything else. 3 visits, 3 arrivals, a man carrying grief for his grandfather, a woman carrying his grandfather's history in 15 bound journals, and now this, an envelope in Frances's handwriting from a week before she died. She sat on the stool. She set the envelope on the bench. She didn't open it yet, because some things required sitting with the weight of them before you could bear to see what was inside, because Frances had taught her that too, not in words, in the way she handled the really damaged pieces, the ones that had been wound too hard or dropped or stored wrong. She would set them on the bench and sit with them first. Just sit. Just let the thing be what it was before deciding what it needed. Mara sat with the envelope. The clock ticked, even, unhurried, certain, the sound of something built to last and doing exactly that. Part 3. The second chair. She opened the letter that night. After the clock was wound and the cot was laid out and the bench light was off, and the only light in the room came from the small lamp she'd set on the floor near the door, Mara sat on the wooden stool and held the envelope and finally opened it. Frances's handwriting, the same handwriting that had labeled 30 years of work orders, the same handwriting that had written the clock's name and the fault and the repair completed in Frances's specific shorthand that Mara had spent 3 years learning to read. Except here, it was not shorthand. Here, it was the full handwriting, the slow, deliberate version that Frances used when she was writing something that needed to last. Dear Elaine, she read slowly, I am writing because I am leaving soon. I don't know exactly when, but my heart has been telling me for a while that we're in the last portion, and I have learned to listen when things tell me their nature. There are things I need to say about Mara. She has the ear. I have never said this out loud to anyone because saying it feels too large, like naming something that should stay unnamed, but I am saying it now because you need to understand what she is and what she will be capable of. She can hear a fault in a clock before the fault becomes damage. She can hear whether a movement is wearing wrong by the sound of it running. She can calibrate an escapement by listening to it without instruments and achieve what a timing machine would achieve. In 31 years of this work, I have not encountered this in any person except myself, and in me it was less. This is what she is. And she is also a 20-year-old girl who has spent her life making herself smaller than she needs to be, which is something I could not undo entirely, and which I tried very hard to undo, and which I think she is going to have to finish undoing herself out in the world in situations I cannot prepare her for from this kitchen. There is a clockmaker's shop in Ridgecroft, Vermont, Carver Street, Venn and Son Timepieces. It has been closed since 1969, and the town has held the deed in surplus since 2011. I have been checking on it for years, making sure it stays available, making sure it doesn't get sold to someone who doesn't understand what it is. What it is a place for Mara. Silas Venn left it for exactly this purpose. I know because I visited him in 1984, and he told me. He said, whoever has the ear after you send them, the shop will be ready. He left tools and a mainspring and a letter and everything a person needs to start. He said it was a gift for the next clockmaker of the valley, whoever that turned out to be. I have not told Mara about it. I want her to walk through that door on her own terms, not because I pointed her there. I want her to find it the way I found it, by following what she was trained to follow, which is the sound of things, which always eventually leads somewhere, but she needs someone to make sure nothing is in the way. Elaine, I am asking you to be that person. I know what I am asking. I know what you owe her, and I know you know it too. I am not asking you to fix everything. I am asking you to do this one thing. Make sure when the time is right that she finds Ridgecroft. Make sure the building is available. Make sure nobody has bought it out from under her before she gets there. And if she needs a reason to go, give her one. Any reason. Just get her moving in that direction. You owe her something. I am giving you a way to pay part of it. That's all this is. Do this and you will have done something worth doing. I love you both. Francis. Mara set the letter on her knee. She sat with it for a long time. The clock ticked. Outside Carver Street was quiet, the way small Vermont streets were quiet at night. Not silent, just the absence of anything urgent. A dog somewhere. The wind picking up briefly and then stopping. The building settling around her the way old buildings settled minute adjustments against the cold. She thought about Francis writing that letter, a week before she died, knowing she was leaving, sitting at the kitchen bench where they had spent 11 years of Saturday mornings, writing to the daughter who had left 16 years before, not asking Elaine to come back, not asking for anything for herself, asking for something for Mara, asking the person who had done the leaving to be the person who made sure Mara arrived somewhere. Do this and you will have done something worth doing, which was Francis exactly, which was so completely Francis that it was almost funny. Almost. The way certain true things were almost funny, because their truth was so precise that the precision itself created a kind of relief. She lay on the cot that night and looked at the ceiling and listened to the clock tick and did not sleep for a long time. But when she finally did sleep, it was the deepest sleep she had managed in 3 years. Ernest Cade arrived on a Thursday morning in June. Mara heard him before she saw him, the sound of a car she didn't recognize, older than most of the cars that came down Carver Street, driven with the deliberate care of someone who understood that vehicles required thoughtful handling. He parked and sat for a moment before getting out, the way people sometimes sat for a moment before doing a thing they had been thinking about for a long time. He was 76 years old, with gray hair cut close, and the build of a man who had spent his life doing physical work at a fine scale, Not large, not small, just precisely the size his work had made him. He walked with a slight adjustment in his gait that suggested some old injury that had healed imperfectly, but had healed. He carried nothing. He came through the door and stood in the room and looked at the master regulator for approximately 45 seconds without speaking or looking away. Then he said very quietly, "He always said it would run again." "You knew him," Mara said. "I was his last apprentice." He turned to look at her. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had been paying very close attention for a very long time. 1967 through 1969. He took me on when I was 19. I was with him the day he closed the shop. She looked at him. "Ernest Cade," he said. "He told me someone would come eventually. He told me on the last day when he locked the door. He said, keep the building sound and keep it in the town's hands. Don't let anyone buy it. It's for whoever comes with the ear." He moved to the bench and set his hands on the surface, not touching anything, just setting his hands down the way you set your hands down when you needed to feel what a space was holding. His hands were the hands of someone who had spent decades in fine work, not fine in the sense of delicate, fine in the sense of precise, the kind of hands that had learned to feel things that other people measured. "You've been maintaining the building," Mara said, "since 1969. He looked at the repaired plaster, the refinished floor sections, or I was until the Historical Commission took over the exterior work. After that, I stayed involved at the structural level, making sure the foundation was sound, making sure the roof held." He paused. "It needed a new roof in 2003. I put it on myself." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. He smiled, not wide, just the small smile of someone who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation. "Because Francis Ashby asked me to," he said. "The room changed, not dramatically, the way rooms change when the important thing arrived, a shift in the air, a settling. I was here in 1984, he said, when she came. I was doing maintenance on the east wall, some moisture damage that needed addressing. She arrived with a letter she'd sent to Silas's old address, and which I had collected because I still collected his mail by then." He looked at Mara's face. "She spent 3 days here. Silas came from Randolph. He had moved to Randolph by then, after he sold his house, and he taught her. I stayed. I did the work I'd come to do, and I didn't intrude, but I was here." "You took the photograph," Mara said. He looked at the shelf above the workbench where the photograph of Frances sat in the second chair. "Yes," he said. "She was sitting there and Silas was at the main bench and they were working on the regulator movement. He had taught her to do a full regulation by ear and she was practicing, and I thought this should be documented, so I took the photograph." He paused. "She didn't know I was going to. I showed her afterward." "What did she say?" He was quiet for a moment. "She said I'm going home to teach someone everything I just learned, and that person is going to come here one day." She said it simply, like it was a fact she already knew, not a prediction. He looked at Mara. "She asked me to keep the building ready, to make sure it stayed in the town's hands and didn't decay beyond function. She said she didn't know when she didn't know who exactly, but someone was coming." "That was 40 years ago," Mara said. "Yes." She looked at him. "You've been waiting for 40 years, she said. He looked at the clock. "The building needed maintaining regardless," he said, "and I had nowhere else I needed to be." He paused. "Also, Silas said the same thing, before she did. He said it on the last day in 1969, and then Francis said it in 1984. When two people tell you the same thing 16 years apart, you tend to believe it. She had been told things in her life. She had been told she was temporary, that she was second, that she was contingent on other people's primary arrangements. She had been told this not with words, but with the architecture of every situation she had lived inside from the time she was 6 years old. She had not been told, not clearly, not directly, that anything was being held for her, that anything was being maintained, that 40 years of a man keeping a roof sound and a foundation solid was in some specific way being done on her behalf. The clock ticked. She needed a minute. She turned to the bench and picked up the movement she'd been working on before Ernest arrived, and she regulated the escapement, 1/4 turn at a time, listening while he stood and waited with the patience of someone who had been waiting for decades and found a few more minutes entirely manageable. When she set the movement down, her hands were steady. "I have 15 journals," she said. "Silas's work journals. There's something in them I need help understanding." "Then let's understand it," Ernest said. They sat at the bench together. She brought the journals from the shelf where Clara had left them, stacked and organized and marked with small slips of paper at relevant entries. Ernest moved through them, the way someone moved through a space they had been in before, not unfamiliar, just seeing it differently now. He touched the spines of the journals with his fingertips, feeling the cloth covers, and she noticed he spent a moment longer on each one than strictly necessary. She was about to ask why when he turned and explained without being asked. "I'm partially deaf," he said. "Left ear mostly. An accident about 20 years ago. Machine that should have been secured." He looked at his hands. "I adapted. The hands take on more of the work when the ears give out." He touched the bench surface. "I can feel the vibration of a movement through a workbench surface from 10 feet away. Different sensation than hearing it, but sufficient." She understood suddenly what Francis had built into her, not just the ear, the hands. Francis had not simply been teaching Mara to hear clocks for 11 years. She had been building the secondary knowledge alongside the primary one, the tactile understanding that would back up the auditory one, the hands learning what the ears knew, so that if one went, the other remained, so she could listen in whatever way the work required. Ernest opened the 12th journal, turned pages. "Here," he said. The entry was dated October 1958. She read, "The spring fund Silas had written has been formalized as of this date. The 11 men have each agreed to contribute according to their means. Thomas Holt of Randolph contributes his share as documented below. The fund will grow and be maintained in convertible form until the right person arrives to receive it. This is not compensation. This is not recovery of the broker's theft. This is the 11 of us deciding together what we will do with what was taken from us, which is to transform it into something it was not before, which is a beginning for someone who has not yet begun." Mara read it twice, then a third time. The spring fund. Not recovered money, not money Silas had gathered from the broker's estate. Money the 11 men had contributed, voluntarily, each according to his means. Thomas Holt of Randolph contributing his share. She turned to the next marked entry, and the next. Across a dozen entries, in 3 different journals, Silas had documented each contribution, each purchase of gold, each addition to the fund with the precision of a man who understood that records were how the future knew what the past intended. And at the end of the last entry, November 1969, the day he closed the shop, the fund now totals what has been accumulated across 20 years of contributions and maintenance. I am placing it with the spring in the compartment for whoever comes with the ear. They will know what it represents. They will know what to do with it. The 11 men gave this freely, each making the same decision. We will not let what was taken from us define the end of the story. We will let it define a beginning instead. Thomas Holt. Mara sat with this. Thomas Holt of Randolph, Marcus's grandfather, who had lost $4,000 in 1938 and had somehow, through some private extraordinary decision, contributed to a fund intended to start the next clockmaker's workshop, had not just survived what was taken from him, had turned it into something else entirely, had given. She called Marcus Holt. "I need you to come back," she said. "Today, if you can." He was there in 2 hours. He came in and looked at Ernest and Clara, who had arrived that morning to continue her archival work, and he looked at the stack of open journals on the bench, and he looked at Mara, and he waited. She put the 12th journal in front of him, pointed to the entry dated October 1958. He read. She watched his face. He read the way she read clock movements, starting at the beginning and moving through it, and not skipping anything, and arriving at the end, having taken the full measure of what was there. His hands were on the bench, very still. He turned to the next marked entry. Read it. Turned to the next, and the next. When he reached the last one, the November 1969 entry, he read it twice. Then he stood very still with his hands on the bench for a long time. He wasn't just a victim, Marcus said. No, Mara said. He gave money. He contributed. Yes. He knew about the fund. He participated in it. Yes. Marcus looked at the entry, at Thomas Holt of Randolph contributing his share, documented right there in Silas Venn's precise handwriting, the same handwriting as the letter she had found in the hidden compartment, the same handwriting that had labeled the drawers of the workbench. He never said a word, Marcus said, very quiet, the quiet of something that had been one shape for 55 years and had just become a different shape. My father didn't know. I didn't know. He let us think he had just lost the money, that it was just a loss. His jaw moved. He didn't want credit for it. No, Mara said. He decided privately. He contributed privately. He let the world know him as someone who lost money in a fraud, and he didn't correct that. Because it wasn't about the credit, Clara said quietly from across the bench. The fund documentation says as much. The 11 men specifically agreed it would be undocumented publicly. They didn't want the decision to be about them. They wanted it to be about whoever came after. Marcus looked at the journal for another long moment. Then he looked at Mara. Can I have a copy of these pages? He said. Yes, Clara said. I'm preparing a full archival record. You'll have everything. He nodded once. He was not a man who cried in front of strangers. She could see that. He had built a face that didn't do that over 55 years of whatever he had lived, but something was moving in it right now that was not controlled and was not hidden and was under everything enormous. He told me once, Marcus said, when I was maybe 12 years old sitting in his kitchen, he said the best thing you can do with a hard thing is decide what you're going to do with it. He looked at the journal. I thought that was just something he said, the kind of thing old men said. It wasn't just something he said, Mara said. Marcus stood at the bench for another moment. Then he picked up his jacket. He stopped at the door. The documentation Clara is preparing, he said, for the archival record. He paused. I'd like my grandfather's name on whatever you build from this. Not for me, for him. So it's recorded. It will be, Clara said. He left. The room was quiet except for the clock. Mara stood at the bench with the open journals in front of her, and Ernest beside her, and Clara across from her, and the photograph of Francis on the shelf above them, all sitting in the second chair, learning from a man who had decided that what was taken from him would not define the end of the story. Ernest was looking at the photograph. You found the secondary compartment faster than she did, he said. She looked at him. She found it in 11 minutes, he said. I timed her. I showed her where it was, and she pressed her palms to the wood and found the seam in 11 minutes. He turned to look at Mara. You found it faster. Because I've been working with my hands longer, Mara said. No, he said, because she prepared your hands better than Silas prepared hers. She had 30 years of teaching by the time she was teaching you, and Silas had almost none. The preparation got better each time. He looked at her directly. Each link in the chain is stronger than the one before it. That's how a good chain works. The chain that had run from Silas to Francis to Mara, that had held through closed shops and arthritis and deaths and 3 years of not knowing where you were going, that had held because at every point along it, someone had decided to teach, to pass something on, to prepare the next pair of hands and ears for what was coming. The chain does not break. It has never broken yet. Clara handled the formal documentation with the efficient thoroughness of someone who had spent 20 years making sure important things were correctly recorded. She prepared the archival record of the Spring Fund, the 11 contributors, and the provenance of the gold. She submitted the documentation to the State Historical Commission for the building's formal designation, which had been informally held for years and which, with the journal documentation, could now be properly supported. The building on Carver Street was formally designated a Vermont Heritage Craft Site, which meant it could not be sold, developed, or repurposed without a historical review process that would take approximately as long as a person would want to continue operating a business there, which was for Mara's purposes as good as permanent. The Venn Ashby Workshop Fund was established in September. Mara had decided on the name carefully, Venn first, because the fund was the continuation of what Silas had started and the 11 men had given toward. Ashby, because Francis had been the middle link, the person who had traveled from there to here across 40 years and one 3-day visit to a closed shop in Vermont. The fund's purpose was to support apprenticeships in traditional craft for young people in foster care or transitional housing, not general support. Specific craft apprenticeships, the kind where a person sat beside another person for hours at a time and received what could not be transmitted any other way. Ernest served as craft advisor. Clara documented the history and provenance. Thomas Holt's name appeared on the founding document as one of the 11 original contributors to the Spring Fund from which the Workshop Fund was derived, not as a victim, as a founder. Marcus sent a short note when he received his copy. 4 lines. He said his grandfather would have been glad. He said some things take a long time to resolve and still resolve correctly. He signed his name. She called Elaine in October, not to repair everything, not to begin something she wasn't ready to begin, but because Francis had written that letter and Elaine had brought it, and those were facts that deserved acknowledgement. I read the letter, Mara said. I know, Elaine said. She asked you to make sure I found the shop. Yes. You didn't. No. A pause that was longer than comfortable and shorter than impossible. I don't need you to have done it, Mara said. I got here anyway, but I wanted to tell you that I read it. Okay, Elaine said. Her voice was the voice of someone receiving something very carefully. She loved you, Mara said. She was asking you for something because she thought you could do it. That's what it reads like. A longer pause. I know, Elaine said. Okay, Mara said. Okay. The call lasted 8 minutes, which was not enough to fix anything, which was also not nothing. Ernest came on Thursdays. He did not come as a teacher exactly. He came as someone who sat in the second chair and told her what he knew when she needed to know it. The specific form of teaching that required the student to be the one asking. He told her about movements he had known across 40 years of restoration work. He showed her the specific grip for a balanced staff removal that prevented micro damage that accumulated over a career into thousands of small, unnecessary replacements. He told her about Silas, how Silas had moved through the shop, how he had listened before he touched, how he had understood that every movement had a personality that emerged when it was running, and that knowing that personality was knowing the clock, and knowing the clock was knowing how to care for it. He listened with his hands more than his ears now. She watched him work and understood something she hadn't understood before about what Francis had built into her, not just the ear, the hands, 12 years of Saturday mornings building the secondary knowledge alongside the primary one, so that if one went, the other remained, so she could listen in whatever way the work required. Ernest had found the secondary compartment on his 3rd Thursday. She had shown him where it was. He had pressed his palms to the wood and moved them slowly across the surface until the pressure changed. "There," he had said, not triumphant, just certain. "Yes," she had said. He had nodded. "She found it in 11 minutes. You found it faster." He had looked at the photograph of Frances on the shelf. "Each link stronger than the last. That's how the chain works." On the first morning of November, Mara came to the bench before she wound the clock. She sat on the stool and looked at the room, the repaired walls, which were smooth and even now, and caught the morning light from the display window at an angle that made the tin ceiling's pattern visible across its full extent. The workbench with its row of small drawers, each labeled in Silas Venn's handwriting, each containing what it was labeled to contain. The shelves along the right wall where the clients' clocks waited in their turn, 9 of them this week, from 9 different families, 9 different relationships between a household and its history. The photograph of Frances on the shelf above the workbench, sitting in the second chair. The second chair was now pulled up beside the bench on the left side where Ernest sat on Thursdays. She had found it in the storage room at the back of the shop when she cleared it in April, a wooden chair with a rush seat clearly original to the shop. She had repaired the rush seat herself, which had taken 3 attempts and a library book on traditional weaving before she got it right. She had set it at the bench. Ernest had sat in it, and the bench had looked the way it was supposed to look. Mara looked at the photograph. Frances, in 1984, 40 years old, sitting in this chair, the second chair, the student's chair, with her loop to her eye and the regulator movement on the mat in front of her, and the careful quality of total attention that Mara had spent 11 years watching and had never been able to fully describe until now. What it was love, not the soft, decorative kind that presented itself as love, the kind that sat beside someone for 11 years on Saturday mornings and said, "Listen, do you hear it? Listen harder. You have the ear. Now use it." The kind that traveled to a closed shop in Ridgecroft and learned something and went home and spent the rest of her working life transmitting it, Saturday by Saturday, into the hands and ears of a girl who needed it more than she knew. The kind that wrote a letter from a dying kitchen table to a woman who had left, asking her to do one thing, do this one thing, do something worth doing. She stood up, she opened the glass door of the master regulator. She wound the spring, 3 turns, precisely, the way Silas had engineered it to need the way she wound it every morning at 7:15, because that was the hour Frances had wound Mr. Copley's watch every day for 31 years, and some habits were how you kept faith with the people who taught you. The pendulum swung, the gear train moved, the escapement ticked, and the shop on Carver Street in Ridgecroft, Vermont, which had been silent from 1969 until March of this year, which had been waiting with a mainspring sealed in a wall in 41 gold coins and a letter addressed to whoever had the ear, which had been maintained for 55 years by a man who took a woman's word for it, that someone was coming, that shop filled with the sound of a movement that had been built correctly and was running as it was supposed to run. Steady, even, certain. She closed the glass door. She sat back down at the bench. She picked up the movement she had been working on before she stopped to look at the room. A Vienna regulator with a suspension spring that had finally given after years of service. A straightforward repair, a clean problem with a clear solution. She cut the new suspension spring to length, trimmed it with precision, fitted it in place. She set the movement aside for its test run. She looked at the second chair, empty until Thursday, except that it wasn't quite empty, because Mara had spent 11 years watching Frances occupy a version of it, the same chair, different kitchen, same posture, same attention, and knew exactly how it looked when it was occupied by someone who understood what they were there to receive. And so even on the days when no one was sitting in it, The chair carried the shape of that occupancy the way old chairs carried the shape of the people who had sat in them longest. Frances had sat there in 1984 and learned something, had carried it home, had put it piece by piece Saturday morning by Saturday morning into the hands and ears of a girl who needed it, and the girl had grown into a woman who was 20 years old and sitting at the clockmaker's bench in a shop that had been waiting for her, and who wound the spring every morning at 7:15 because the spring needed winding, and the clock needed to run, and the shop needed to sound the way it was supposed to sound, which was this sound, even on both sides, unhurried, correct. She put on the loop, she bent over the movement, and she listened.